Hey everyone, it's Blake again, here with ChessPathways.com, and we're doing another game analysis video today from one of our members. Just a reminder, as always, if you want your chess games analyzed, just go to ChessPathways.com today, sign up, and I'll be happy to hear from you. Okay, here we go. This game was sent to me by the player here with the white pieces, Krikorian. I like how they annotated this game. There's some good lessons to learn, so let's go ahead and go through it. E4, C5, D4, takes C3. So they're playing the Smith-Morra gambit. White sacrifices a pawn here, but the idea is if black accepts this sacrifice, white is down a pawn, but white has a lot of open lines for their pieces. The rooks will often come to, say, the C and D files, and white's just going to get a big lead in development. So in light of that, black chooses to decline the gambit, and after C3 they play E6. So here you played knight F3. You didn't give much of a comment on this move, other than a couple moves later you said you're not too familiar with the positions that arise when the gambit's declined. If you're not too familiar, I would recommend just take back with the pawn in the center, right? Black doesn't want to go for this gambit line, but here white gets the whole center. I think this is a pleasant line here for white. If I'm not mistaken, this transposes to a line from the Alapin Sicilian. After E4, C5, C3, and then D4 is the Alapin. C3, and let's say black plays here, E6, D4, and takes, and you just get the same position. You transpose to this line from the Alapin. Which is typical, by the way. When you play the Smith-Morra gambit, a lot of times when the gambit's declined, you just transpose to an Alapin. So if you're going to play the Smith-Morra, make sure you learn at least a little Alapin theory too. E6, knight F3 is playable though. D5, and I checked the database, this position's already pretty rare, as early as move 4. This position doesn't occur very often, so we're kind of already in original territory here. You go ahead and exchange on D5, and you take back with the knight here. I think both moves are reasonable. Taking back with the pawn leads to this kind of symmetrical position. Both sides have an isolated D-pawn. White's probably a little bit better just because white has that extra tempo of development, but it is really symmetrical, and a lot of players don't like playing those, really symmetrical positions. Knight takes d4 leads to a completely different kind of position, right? Here, black's going to maintain their space advantage, right? Black's the only player with a pawn in the center, and it's just going to stay that way. But at the same time, black's also the only one with a weakness here. They have this isolated d-pawn, and like you said, you say a couple moves later, your comment is this looks like a pretty typical isolated queen's pawn position. And yeah, that is, I would agree with that assessment here. So let's go ahead and talk about some typical plans in isolated queen's pawn positions. So usually the player with the isolated queen's pawn, like I said, they have a space advantage, they have an easy time developing their pieces, they have open lines for everything, and a lot of times they're going to rely on piece activity to get an advantage, sometimes launching an attack against the opponent king, sometimes even breaking through in the center, after they put their rooks on some good central files and develop all their pieces. The pawn breakthrough, pawn to d4 might even be possible. So those are the advantages of having this isolated queen's pawn in the center. When you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn, let's go ahead and clear some of those arrows. When you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn, it's kind of the opposite. One of your main goals is to blockade the square in front of the pawn, like this knight's doing here, and because there's no pawns on the adjacent files from your opponent, they're going to have a hard time kicking your piece off of this square. It's kind of a nice permanent outpost in the center. And a lot of times when you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn, one of your goals can be to exchange all the minor pieces, because in the rook and queen endgame, in the major piece endgame, you're going to have a big advantage. You can just triple on the d-file, kind of use all your firepower to generate pressure against this pawn, and the fact that it's the only weakness on the board is really going to stand out. So if you can get all those minor pieces off the board, because remember, the main advantage of having the pawn is the open lines for the minor pieces. If you can just eliminate all the minor pieces, there's no more attack against your king. All those major pieces attacking the pawn are going to give you an advantage. So knight f6, let's see how the game proceeds here. And you play bishop to g5. Bishop e7, knight d2, castle, knight 2 to f3. So here both sides just seem to be developing their pieces. I don't really have too much to criticize here. Knight to c6, bishop e2, h6, bishop h4. Black just put the question to that bishop, and you go ahead and retreat it, and kind of maintain this pressure here. I'm guessing one of your plans, based on kind of what happened in the game, and just your comment about how it's a typical isolated queen's pawn position, is to exchange those minor pieces. And it looks like you were successful in doing so, if we go forward a few moves. Rook e8, you castle. It's always good to get your king to safety. Bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, and queen to a4. Kind of the first move that's not just, basic developing, getting your pieces out and getting castled. And the idea here is to threaten a pawn. You're threatening knight takes c6, winning a pawn. And you also mentioned you want to clear the d1 square for a rook, so you can begin putting pressure on this weak d5 pawn. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think all your thinking and moves so far have been reasonable. I would still consider this position to be fairly balanced, though. I don't think either side really has a big advantage. Black still has all those open lines for their pieces. They still have the long-term liability of the isolated queen's pawn, but it's definitely not going to be won by force anytime soon. So I think both players have reasons to be okay with this position. Black exchanges on d4. They play pawn to a6 there, maybe trying to stop an annoying knight to b5 at some point. You go ahead and exchange on h5 and on e7. Like I said, it looks like you're trying to exchange, as many minor pieces as possible. And we're left with this position. You're definitely very firmly blockading that isolated pawn. And at this point, I kind of do think this is kind of pleasant for white. It seems like you have an easy plan here just to, put a rook on the d file, maybe even bring the queen to the b3 square, start really pressuring this guy. And black doesn't seem to have too big of counterplay here on the king side. There's no real attack forming against your king, at least yet. So I would assess this as being kind of pleasant for white. I think if I was black here, I might have looked to have done something a little different here than playing a6 and allowing, two exchanges of minor pieces. I think that really plays into the hands of the opponent who's playing against my isolated pawn. So going forward, after rook takes e7, yeah, now you played knight f5, and you said you don't like this move because it doesn't tactically work. You had some idea here of possibly playing the queen to g4 soon, which makes sense, but unfortunately there's just rook e4, and your knight really should just be coming right back to d4. So the idea didn't work, but that's okay. But black is getting some, activity here on the king side now. Yeah, and unfortunately, I think those two tempos are actually kind of critical, because now it's pretty easy to imagine black getting activity here, right? They can play like queen g5, bring their rook to the open file. You're still not really winning this pawn anytime soon, and black's getting some serious pressure here. So yeah, unfortunately, it's good that you identified it was a mistake after knight f5 and came right back, but those two tempos do really hurt. So I think instead of knight f5, like you mentioned, you already have a simple plan. You should probably just maybe contest the e-file, put the other rook on d1 at some point. You have a really simple plan here of just, playing against the isolated pawn and not letting black build an attack. But after knight f5, rook e4, knight d4, knight to f4, you bring your queen back to d1. It looks like you're heading to f3 to guard against the attack on the g2 pawn. That's good foresight there to see what your opponent's up to. Like I always say, you always want to ask what your opponent's doing, right, before you make any move. h5. Interesting. Trying to get this pawn involved, maybe taking away the g4 square from your own queen. Possibly even g5, g4 could be an idea later, although that looks very double-edged, opening up black's own king. But because black has easy access to the king side here, I could see black possibly considering doing this, although it is very risky, of course. It would have to be timed well. Queen f3. That's a good square for the queen. Black goes ahead and finally brings their queen to g5. And here you played king h1. I think you were trying to get out of any pin ideas here. But you do mention rook f to e1 looks like a better move contesting this file. And I think that makes sense. Remember, after queen g5, not only does this activate the queen, it also kind of has the positional threat to activate the other rook and really dominate this file. Because if black's allowed to play rook a8 here, then you're not going to be able to put a rook on e1 without some maneuvering. And I don't think there's an urgent need to play king h1 yet, because black's not actually threatening knight takes h3 right now, of course. Your queen can still take. So I think I would agree there. It's probably best to play a rook to e1 and not let black just double on the file. King h1, rook a to e8, and queen to g3, offering that exchange of queens. So you didn't give a comment with this move, but I actually think it's a significant mistake. Remember, really your only advantage here, black has all the activity, right? Your big advantage here is the better pawn structure. And if black exchanges queens here, now your pawn structure is not looking so great either. And I think black can just kind of dominate your second rank here, right? Black didn't exchange queens, but it looks like after black just exchanges queens and plays knight e2, this looks like it could be trouble for white. Like, you're probably going to have to exchange here on e2. They're threatening knight g3, they're threatening to take your knight. Knight f5 I don't think works. I know you're threatening like knight d6, but I think black can just play g6, and I don't think this works out for you very well. After this, black takes on g3, they're going to win an exchange too, they won a pawn. Yeah, so after knight e2, I think you have to exchange on e2. And now black's rooks are just really dominating. It's a double rook endgame, and the activity of the rooks is such an important factor in those double rook endgames. This pawn's weak. Black can maybe even come down to your second rank with both rooks, which would definitely be bad for you. And I think black has a significant advantage here. This pawn's potentially weak. Yeah, I think black missed a big opportunity here to capitalize on your queen g3 move here, which I'm pretty sure is a mistake. I don't know what you should play instead. I think you have, several options. Maybe even something like a4 just to stop black from expanding on the queen side, because I don't think black has any concrete threats yet. But offering this exchange of queens in this circumstance, when it results in the doubled pawns and the rook getting down to the second rank, I don't think is a good option, and black missed a chance. So instead, black played queen f6, just kind of keeping the pressure on the board. And after queen f6 here, you played f3. Now, this looks very dangerous to me, playing f3, creating more holes around your king. Potentially, black can even put this pawn on h4 at some point and bring the knight to g3, and you're going to have to be really careful about these outposts that you're giving the black pieces here. Usually, this pawn structure in general around the king, this very gaping wide open pawn structure on the dark squares, it's often very dangerous. And you mentioned some ideas here of why you played f3. You said you want the queen to be able to cover the e1 square so you can contest that file. And that does make sense. And plus, you're gaining the tempo on the rook. That is true. But remember, pawns can never move backwards. This is a long-term weakness you're creating around your king. And I would be very concerned there about some of the ramifications of that. So I'll see what happened. After, yeah, black does go ahead and play h4, just securing this square as an outpost for the knight. And now queen to g4. Yeah, but after queen g4, like you said, it kind of defies the logic of your last move. You played f3, you created this long-term weakness to try to contest this file, but now you still can't contest the file, because now your queen's not supporting that square anymore. So black just saves that rook. You come down to d7 with your queen. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess it does pressure some of the weak pawns, but I think you have to be very concerned about your king here. I guess black was maybe even threatening rook g5. Yeah, this looks very dangerous. Although if black played rook g5, would you be able to just take on h4? But then black takes on g2. Yeah, there's definitely lines there we would have to calculate depending on what black's going to do. And black doesn't even have to play rook g5 right away, I don't think. So black responds with queen to g5. You come right back. Now that rook g5 is no longer really a threat, it looks like you just want to exchange queens again and try to survive this endgame. Queen back to f6, and you come back to d7. I guess you'd be happy with the draw at this point. You probably realize that you have a disadvantage here, so if black wants to repeat, you should probably be happy with the draw. But of course, black does not want to repeat, and now they set their sights on coming to this g3 outpost that they created in your position by playing h4. So you play king g1 to get out of the fork, knight g3, rook f to d1, queen f4. Yeah, and wow, it looks like black was just able in the game to kind of swing in here, kind of unopposed. Yeah, white really has no way to contest, this open file or keep the pieces out. I think you missed one chance here to stop black from getting in right away by playing knight c2, maybe. Although this even allows, I think, rook e2. Maybe here we could just come back, though. And I think we might be able to survive temporarily, because black can't just play here and here, I don't think, because the rook's still under attack. Something like queen e3, king h2... I'm wondering if black can pull this off. Play queen f2. If we take, they just take. Oh no, I think we can defend everything in the end. Yeah, so this would temporarily stop black from doing anything that would, destroy us right away, I think, playing knight c2. Although it is pretty hard to imagine that white really saves himself here. In the game, after you played queen g4, again trying to exchange queens, of course black doesn't want to. Black plays queen e3 check, queen to f2. All these squares are so under control. White really can't do anything. This rook sat here the whole game. And you finally move it to defend your b-pawn. Now rook to e1, and yeah, it looks like white's in big trouble here on the back rank. Even with two rooks on the back rank, you run into back rank problems. That doesn't happen too often. And black's just going to swing down here and give mate, it looks like. So you exchange. Black's threatening mate. And it doesn't work to take that pawn. That's kind of your last-ditch effort, but it doesn't work because of the discovered check. And among other things, you're losing your queen. That's kind of a best-case scenario. You just lose the queen. Probably you're still getting mated somehow. Either way, it's clear here white's completely lost, and you go ahead and resign. Alright, thanks for sharing that game. That definitely was a good illustration of the dynamic power of the side with the isolated queen's pawn. A lot of players, when they see this pawn, they just think of it as a weakness, especially after you were able to exchange 3 sets of minor pieces. You know, a lot of people would just think, wow, black's definitely not getting an attack now. You know, there's only 1 minor piece left on the board. White's about to just start, you know, ganging up on this pawn. Black really illustrated well in this game how if white's not careful, black can still make something of that space advantage and more mobile pieces to generate something, especially when you let them dominate the open file next to the pawn and, you know, bring their pieces to the king side. Black really had a coordinated effort there, even with only 1 minor piece left on the board. Some things to point out as well are this f3 move, I think, definitely hastened your kind of downfall there. I think if you didn't play f3, you could have resisted a lot better. This knight f5 move back in the middle game, right, just an example of one of these temporary kind of lapses in judgment, right? You had done a great job the whole game kind of always asking what your opponent's going to do if you make this move before you make any move, but it looks like here you just kind of got too excited with your own ideas to come to g4. You just missed that after rook e4, black's really gaining some critical tempos there to accelerate their attack. So this game was a really good example of kind of the pluses and minuses of the isolated queen's pawn. And in this game, it looks like the pluses prevailed, unfortunately for you. Alright, thanks everyone very much for watching. As I said earlier, please make sure to go to chesspathways.com and sign up. We have exclusive content, contests, game analysis videos. Make sure to be part of our community. It's completely free to join. And I hope to see you all soon. Thanks.